So, welcome to this episode of the Rule Breakers podcast. I'm delighted to say that all the way from Canada, my guest today is Liam Quin. How are you doing, Liam?
All right, very well, thank you. How are you?
Good, good. Now, all things considered, I'm good. I'm trying to remember. I think when I first came across you was at an SGML conference, um, maybe Chicago, maybe Boston, someplace like that. And I distinctly remember you had a large green hat on and no shoes. Oh,
Well, you can't see that I'm not wearing shoes today,
oh,
but
okay.
you can see that I'm not wearing a large green hat, although I still have some. Um, I
And I
stopped doing
remember,
that. I stopped doing that. It's partly because I got married. When I got married, my husband didn't really like the attention.
oh, okay.
Um, but one reason I had started doing it at conferences, both at when I worked for SoftQuad in Toronto,
Hmm,
but especially when I worked for the W3C. When I was working for the W3C, there was a danger people would put me on a pedestal, and I found it quite a lot. And they would be nervous about approaching me. They wouldn't speak, they would think I was going to be very serious and very educated and very learned. And
right,
so, so I had a lot of fun dressing up,
right,
and they may have been intimidated for a different reason, but at least it wasn't because they were scared of me, I
right.
think.
Very good.
And where I was able to have those conversations that we needed to be able to have.
Right.
Um,
But I also remember you in the context of the phrase the barefoot typographer. What's the origin of that? Obviously, you've got a deep interest in typesetting, typography.
yeah, ever since being, I was interested in typefaces and fonts ever since being a child, actually. I was maybe 8 years old and I was rereading Lord of the Rings for, I think, the third time.
Good.
And I noticed I was really reading it. I mean, as only a small child will do. And so I read every page, including the imprint page.
Okay.
And the imprint page is the one behind the title page that lets you work out that this is the third edition and who the copyright is and all that stuff for your viewers who may not know. And it said set in, I think it said set in monotype Baskerville 10.5 PT stroke 11 PT. And I didn't know what that meant. And I asked my older brother-in-law, who was a reference librarian and therefore knew everything, because even at the age of 8, I knew librarians were awesome. And he explained to me that it was the typeface that was used for the book.
Right.
But this set off a lifelong interest in writing styles, and I learned calligraphy and have had some success with calligraphy. Never
And is
found out how to get rich from it, but
is that the route that led you into markup, the whole concept of markup? Is that how you're segueing into that?
funnily enough, it is. And as an undergraduate doing computer science, I ended up maintaining the formatter TROF for the University
Okay.
of Warwick and the computer science department and the maths department. And after graduating, I had a paid job for a while producing an edition of Proceedings of a conference
Hmm.
on algebraic topology for Dr. David Epstein,
Uh-huh.
and who was one of the chairs of the conference, and I think Bill Thurston of Princeton was the other. And Bill Thurston had written lots and lots of TROF macros, but there were problems because TROF had limitations. They
Hmm.
weren't inherent limitations, they were just things no one had done. And so I added them, and in fact posted one of the last things I did at Warwick before I left off for another job was I posted all these patches to TROF onto
Okay.
Usenet. And then I moved to a job where I was porting and supporting SoftQuad TROF at a UK reseller in Warrington. And so I got to see, whereas I was familiar with the code of TROF from Berkeley Unix, now I got to see the code of TROF from SoftQuad.
Hmm.
And they had done a lot of typographic enhancements to TROF, starting with different methods of kerning, for example.
Right.
And in fact, when I heard that James Clark, whom you've also interviewed, was writing his own version of TROF, I was at that UK company. I arranged for Softquad to send James a set of their documentation so that GROF's extensions would be compatible with the
very
Softquad
good.
ones.
Didn't know that. Okay.
So I was kind of into standardization in a way, even back then. So eventually I moved from that dealer back to working in Toronto for Softquad. And what I discovered was that selling TROF in the British Isles was easy. Selling TROF in Canada and the US was really hard. And there were two reasons for that. And I'll get back to one of them when we talk about XML more.
Okay.
But there's the geographical difference and an intellectual and attitudinal difference.
Oh, okay. But am I right in saying that TROF ultimately came out of AT&T Bell Labs in New Jersey, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
So it's actually North American.
It is. It certainly is. And its first use, in fact, was typesetting patents.
Right.
Because Bell was a large company. And that was one of the first uses of Unix.
Right, sure.
The writer's workshop, and they built the writer's workbench. That's what it was called. But the geographical difference was that if you had to go and see a customer in Canada, Canada's bigger than the US. Not a lot of people don't realize that.
Right.
But the US is actually bigger than Belgium and Wales and Ireland all put together. A lot bigger. So what happens is you get a customer for TROF in San Francisco, and maybe you spend $5,000 on train tickets, or well, probably not train tickets, on aeroplane tickets and hotels, because you can't fly there and back in the same day. So you don't really want 10% of your costs to come from traveling to visit the customer.
Right.
But if you have to visit the customer twice for a sales call and an installation visit, then, and it's $7,000 each time, kind of using modern numbers, and you've spent then you had better be making a $70,000 sale or $140,000 sale, or you're going to go out of business.
Sure.
In Britain, I could hop on a train from Warrington to London.
And what kind of year are we here now? This
it's late 80s.
Late 80s,
late
right?
80s.
For everyone who's trying to wrap their heads around what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Talking in the days when the World Wide Web didn't exist, there was no Teams.
That's right.
No Zoom, there was none of that stuff. And the on premises didn't even exist as a phrase, because there was no alternative but to have your software on premises.
That's right. And even in early web days and early for installing software, you would typically visit.
Sure.
And
then I'm interested. You mentioned, I didn't actually realize that. I probably should have realized that before now, because the quad in Softquad, I presume, is to do with quad as in the typesetting concept of quadding.
Exactly.
My earliest memory of Softquad was when I came across SGML, the SGML author edit program.
Yep, author editor. Yep,
author editor, which I remember getting my hands on a copy of and installing many moons ago. Were you involved in the code development aspect of that, or were you on the TROF side of Softquad during the SGML author edit days? In other words, prior to the XML days.
Yep. Well, when I moved to Softquad in 1990, and it was partly deliberate on my part, because I thought the closer to the source you get, the better. The more interesting it is, the more influence you have. So I moved to Softquad, and what I discovered was they really weren't able to sell T-ROF in any quantity because of this partly because of this geological problem. And instead, they were pushing the HTML editor. I started speaking at conferences. I connected the company with an academic community, starting with a conference on old dictionaries in Toronto that Tony Healy of the Anglo-Saxon Old English Dictionary Project up in the Fisher Library in Toronto was heading. And I did only a very little work on the code in Author Editor because that was mostly done by the team in Vancouver.
Okay.
I think the only thing I did, I think I wrote the file chooser for Sonos and Solaris on Unix because I happened to have been doing a whole bunch of Unix X11 programming in C. But I was heavily involved in customizing Author Editor. I was involved in document conversion because a lot of people had documents that were not SGML, and in order to become customers of an SGML editor, they needed to have SGML documents. So I came to head the contracting department, and in fact, I said I would only head it on the condition that I could recommend a competitor's product if our product didn't make sense and the competitors did. And that I was not allowed to request features in the product for a particular customer. The first of those was because it's better to have a happy customer of someone else that has done business with you than an unhappy customer with something that doesn't work, particularly in a close-knit community.
Indeed.
And they agreed to that. And the second was because I had seen the chaos that happens if you can turn around and say, we've got a customer who needs such and such a feature, stop all bug fixing, stop all program development for everyone else, and we're going to fetch the one lost sheep. But you can't actually do that. So we had a successful contracting business. And we were going along selling Author Editor. And then one day something happened. Well, two things happened. But the first thing that happened, the head of sales, who was Steve Downey, he went to a trade show, an SGML trade show. I no longer remember which one, but it would probably in 92, I would guess. And when I got back to work after he got home, there was a white paper on my chair. No note, no indication where it had come from. And it was about a thing called Document Archive Controller. And it was written by Hasse Haito of Sweden and several of his colleagues. Magnus and the other names will probably come to me after we finish talking, but it doesn't matter. And they had written an SGML database-driven program. Now, they wrote it. I didn't know this because I had never used EBT's Dynabook, which was the market leader in its field. But their problem was Dynabook was much too expensive for a university in their field because their Dynabook EBT's pricing model was every time you made a new book, a new kind of pre-packaged software book, like to go on a CD-ROM or whatever, you had to pay them money. And at a university, what they wanted to be able to do was every time a paper was published, add it to their collection. So they had written this SGML-based document viewer, which was really fabulous. It had a user interface that was not to be recommended. And the head of marketing at SoftQuad, Linda Berman, had previously worked at Apple, been a product evangelist. So she showed it to Bruce Tognazini at a conference. And he ran screaming. He said, no, just don't define a design interface like this. But he missed the important part, which was that it took the information and the user could apply styles. The markup and the formatting were separate.
Yeah.
The thing that we didn't have with TROF, the thing you don't actually have reliably with tech, because you can always write your own tech macros, even if you're using LaTeX.
Right.
But the thing you do have reliably with HTML, because even if you define an italic element, you can't stop someone else from writing software that prints it in bold
Right.
or not
Sure.
italic at all, or whatever they want. It's generic. So the other thing that happened, so we started selling, we took this and we made it into a product, SoftQuad Explorer, and we didn't sell very many copies, but a few.
Yeah, I think you might have sold one to me. Was this original Swedish system? Was this Sinex viewport?
Sinex AB, yeah. Yes, it was.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yep, it's built since.
I have a story to tell you about that. But the first major HTML project that we got involved in terms of volume, 300 volumes of essentially the Irish Parliament's equivalent of what in the UK is known as Hansard, what's also known in Canada as Hansard. The debate records, or the congressional record, I guess, would be the nearest equivalent to the United States. But what I needed to do there is, as that material was getting captured, because I was involved in working in the XML interest group in the W3C, which we will come back to here in a minute. I had a pretty good idea what XML was going to look like once it finally got through. So we made sure that the HTML markup that we were doing was, within the bounds of what we thought would be in the XML subset. But the thing that we used for a lot of data QA QC was Sinex viewport, precisely because we could just point it at these HTML files and it would just render them and apply the styling on the fly. And it supported a bunch of high time stuff, I remember. So I was able to do some interesting hyperlinking things because we'd modeled it as a large collection of small, interconnected documents as opposed to, individually, large documents. But I may well have been using SoftQuad Panorama as well to do that, because at some point I figured out that was the engine that was underneath SoftQuad.
It was.
And there's this. Did this come before or after the work that I think you were involved in SoftQuad that led to the creation of HoTMetaL, wasn't it? The HTML editor. Was that before or after this?
Yes. Well, it was the same time. What happened was I went to a conference, to a track conference, text retrieval conference. I think it was in Philadelphia in '93. And while I was there, actually, I remember Steve Downey called me and said he was really sorry because so few times did I get to go to a conference, but he needed me to do a sales call. Could I leave early? And I said, okay. And then the conference organizers said, we interrupt the program of this conference to show you a piece of new software that's just been announced. It's being released today. It's called Mosaic, and it's coming from the NCSA. And there were Mark Andreessen and Eric Biener showing off their new piece of software, and the web browser, the first graphical web browser that supported images and didn't just run on the Next as Tim's original one did. Mm-hmm. I had heard of the web, but this was the first time I had seen it. So I came back and said, we've got to get this thing going. And I showed it to Yuri Rubinsky, who was the president of SoftQuad. And it was all hands on, do web stuff. And he and I flew down to meet with Joseph Hardin at NCSA. I think maybe a couple of weeks later. That's how quickly we moved. And Joseph said, what I'd like you to do most of all, I would like SoftQuad, the best known SGML company, I would like SoftQuad to produce an editor for web files. Because the web, he said, is HTML and that's based on SGML. So you can do this. And two people in the last 2 weeks, Eric and Mark, have just left NCSA to start their own company. And they're not going to use HTML anymore. They're going to use RTF.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that would have been a bit of a disaster. All right, because view source principle doesn't really work with RTF. It's full of curly braces and backslashes, and it's actually a step down in readability from TROF, amazingly. So, yeah, it really is. So because there's no real separation at all. So in 6 weeks, I had 2 programmers reporting to me as head of contracting, and I had them both full-time moonlighting in the evening writing HoTMetaL.
Okay.
The head of development wasn't down for this at all. He said, if I catch any of your staff working on HoTMetaL, we didn't even have the name at that point, but working on the web editor during office hours, then that's a fireable offence. The head of documentation at the time, Rodney Boyd, stayed late in the evenings. And I remember I had designed a URL editor because URLs were so new that no one knew them. So I designed this dialog box for editing a URL in a link. And when Rodney came to document it, he looked at my design and said, I can't make this work. I don't see how this could, I can't explain this because it doesn't work in a way that I understand. And he was going on holiday at the end of the week, and we were going to be releasing after he'd gone. So I said, I'll tell you what, you document it in the way that you think would work, and I'll have the programmers implement it that way. And he looked at me as if I had just taken a small child and said, you can have as many candy and toys from this shop as you like. I'm going to walk out. Because no one had ever said that to him before.
Right.
I think no one had ever said your opinion's important.
Right.
And so he documented it, and the programmers looked at his manual and said, oh, we can implement it like this. And they implemented it, and we shipped. Yuri ran off to speak at the First World Web Conference in Geneva. And at that time, the web was a different place. It was very... it was very anti-commercial, very academic. Adverts were definitely not allowed. Businesses were not allowed. You had to be either a large company with a research component, or you had to be university, even to be really on the internet. It was just beginning to change. So Yuri, being Yuri, was on the closing panel of the conference because Yuri had charisma.
Sure.
Right, he really did. As I think, frankly, I think it's because of Yuri that the SGML industry lasted from 1986 to 1996. It's because of Yuri more than anything, more than any other individual. I mean, lots of other people were necessary, but I think without him, it would have failed because he had the dream.
I only met him once, but I agree with you, just based on having just met him once. Yeah, he definitely had that. There was something about him, for sure.
Yep. So at the end of that conference, someone said, God in the audience got up and said, I think the anti-commercial feeling of this, of the web has got to go. And Yuri was very clever. Yuri said, I agree with you. I felt this so strongly that I came here to make an announcement, a commercial announcement, and I didn't feel I could make it. I came to announce that a commercial company, SoftQuad, my company, has just released the first ever commercial HTML editor for the web. And I didn't feel I could make that announcement. In so doing, of course, he made the announcement.
Of course. Yeah.
And he said, you're going to be able to, when you get home, you're going to be able to download it from the NCSA or from softquad.com. The NCSA was hosting it, and OCLC as well. And, and I'm sorry I couldn't make the announcement. So that was Yuri. That was very, very clever.
Absolutely.
The next conference I went to, we had never sold software on a conference floor before because author editor cost $1,200 a seat. And people usually wanted, 10 or 100 of them. So a sale was a big thing. HoTMetaL we sold for $100. And it turned out that was roughly what a lot of businessmen could pay for from a discretionary budget without having to get approval. They could just spend $100 on their corporate credit card and it wouldn't be questioned. So at a trade show in Washington, D.C. that December, we took a dozen copies down with us to sell on the show floor. And Yuri was coming the next day. He spoke on the phone and said, "Have you sold any?" No, we took more than a dozen. I think we took 50 copies. I beg your pardon. Because Yuri, I spoke to him on the phone and he said, "Have you sold any?" I said, "We sold them all in the first 10 minutes. You could bring 200 copies and we would sell them all."
Right,
And
right,
indeed, at the next trade show, we sold $15,000 worth.
right.
Softquad became, for a while, the market leading HTML editor.
Yeah, I remember it.
Until Netscape and Microsoft were fighting over whose browser would be most successful, and they both started including free editing capability.
Indeed,
and that was the end of HoTMetaL.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny,
But at the time,
when you just before we move off, there's so many
yeah.
interesting avenues I'd love to discuss with you. But just even though I only met the man once, he definitely made a big impact on me. And sadly, he passed away not long after I met him. I remember coming back to Ireland, and it was a few months after I'd been in the US at a conference somewhere where I'd met Yuri, and then I heard the sad news that he passed away. But he's always stuck in my head for a couple of reasons. For the charisma of the man, I was very impressed when I met him. But then also for this immortal phrase that he came out with at some point, which was the only thing that's even close to being true in PDF is the F, which I've seen attributed to Yuri Ravinsky. I've always loved that quote. If it is indeed a quote of Ravinsky.
That's great. I didn't know that one, so thank you for that. Yeah.
It's funny. When my big aha moment on the whole web thing, I remember was, I can't remember. It might have been Cello, the Cello browser. Maybe it was Mosaic. I can't remember. But I remember one day in my office in Ballina, County Mayo, in the west of Ireland, and this new thing. I've been using a dial-up service in order to get at UUCP and Gopher, all of those things, that were on the original internet. And that's how I got my daily dose of comp.text.html, and basic email capabilities and so on. But then up popped this this browser. Maybe it was Mosaic. I honestly can't remember, but I do remember doing view source, seeing the view source button, and looking and seeing that it was basically HTML under the hood. It was a HTML schema, so it was essentially an HTML based document type definition. And I remember going, "Oh my gosh, I think this actually changes everything." And that was my kind of, oh, this is going to be big type moment. Because up until that moment, just as you've been talking there, like you've mentioned, Softquad Panorama, Sinex Viewport, EBT that you mentioned, electronic book technologies. Microsoft had, CD-ROM publications back in the day, like Encarta and Cinemania and so on, that were ultimately RTF based, because that's what Microsoft used for navigable Windows help files, and Microsoft Multimedia Viewer, which was a sort of a bigger, go faster version of the online help viewer for Windows 3.1. But that was all RTF under the hood. I remember at the time reading somewhere along the line, I read that Microsoft, similar to what you said about Mark Andreessen and leaving NCSA to set up his own company, that I believe Microsoft at one stage had an internal project called Project Blackbird, which was going to be some sort of electronic document browsing thing, but it was going to be RTF based. But then came the Bill Gates famous memo, to all the staff, that the web changes everything, factor the web and HTML into everything that you do, and I guess the rest is history. You got involved in some HTML standardization efforts. Was it IETF? Were you involved?
Yes, it was. So the IETF met in Toronto, and there was an opening meeting saying about HTML, and I went to that because I was living in Toronto working at Softquad. And so I got involved and I met Tim Berners-Lee there, and a number of other people. Dan Connolly was there. I don't remember who else would eventually work at W3C. And so I was involved in the HTML working group. And around this time, it was just, well, around this time, we had this idea of doing a web plugin using Sinex Viewport.
Right.
And this is where Panorama came in. And we shipped it. We showed it to people, a number of people, including John Bozak, who I think was then at Novell, but moved to Sun very shortly afterwards. And in both cases, he was responsible for, I think, up between 100,000 and 250,000 pages of documentation for an operating system. And certainly at Sun, he had it in SGML. I showed it to the now late Michael Sperber McQueen, much missed, who in fact continued to use it for the rest of his life, I think, or pretty much. What was it? It was a Netscape plugin that worked in all of the main browsers that would show SGML files.
Okay.
It would download the DCD, it would download a style sheet, or possibly more than one style sheet. It would download the SGML file, display it, and you could annotate it and upload your annotations, assuming you had a suitable server, or you could just use a floppy back then. But you could also put the annotations on the server, and then anyone else seeing the document could view them. So, for example, Apple circuit boards were made by DEC, in fact, on the outskirts of Ottawa in Kanata. And every day there would be instructions for the workers on the assembly line. There would be changes. Things like solder a patch wire from this connector to this connector. And stuff called Panorama let them view the document, and the changes would be overlaid over the image. Okay, there'd be little boxes that they could click on and see what the instructions were. And they didn't have to go around to each computer and load anything because it was on a server. Now, today, anyone would say you'd make that a web application. We had a customer who made telephone exchanges. And it turned out a telephone exchange manual was about 30,000 pages. And so we had a version of Panorama made that would download just a little bit of the SGML and download more in the background so that you could scroll and kind of, free things so that you wouldn't need to know that it was doing this. And that was, however, meanwhile, EBT, of course, who didn't like Panorama, mute my notifications over there. EBT had their own, they never shipped it as far as I know, but they had made their own plugin and they gave it to a few customers. But what the customers discovered was that there was no SGML file that would work in both Softquad Panorama and the EBT package.
Okay.
This was a common problem in SGML because some programs required a doc type declaration at the beginning of a file. Others required the DTD to be prepended to the file, and others required neither. And each one would not accept the options chosen by the others. As a result, and then, of course, Panorama implemented a subset of SGML, and so did the EBT viewer, and it wasn't the same subset.
Not the same subset. Right.
And John Bozak said, this is no good. I can't bet the future of Solaris, Sun's operating system, on a browser plugin that's proprietary. Right. I can use a proprietary tool and I'll buy it, but it needs to be running on a standard so that someone else could implement a competitor so that we're not relying, we don't get up a creek. And so he took that to the then not fairly recently formed W3C. It was so recently formed that John wrote a whole bunch of what became the W3C process in order to start the XML activity.
Okay.
And he started a group called WebSGML to standardize the SGML that the viewers would see. And that is what became XML. Because the name WebSGML, the group decided wasn't sexy enough. It needed an X in it.
Right.
Today it's anything but an X, but then it was X's were sexy in standards. So I wanted it called markup definition language, MDL.
MDL. Okay.
Yeah. But the idea was simply that because you could define your own languages in it, and I wanted to emphasize that.
Right.
But I got that was a non-starter because it wasn't sexy, didn't have an X in it.
Right.
So we ended with XML. And that's
and so that was obviously the beginnings of, I guess, the XML side of the W3C. I mean, how quickly after that did you join W3C? Because you were the XML activity lead there.
Well, okay, it's about 5 years.
Okay.
A couple of things had to happen first. The first is I was having a whale of a time at SoftQuad for a while, and one of the last things that Yuri did, in fact, is we had been starting to work on a DSL implementation. I know James mentioned the DSL DSSSL formatting language that he'd edited at ISO. Well, we needed a standard way of formatting for SoftQuad, and SoftQuad TROF wasn't it because it wasn't a standard way. And we didn't have a good connection between SGML and TROF, amazingly. So I got together a group of people and ran a symposium, which you will never have heard of because it was private. It was invite only. But James Clark went. And we had a bunch of other people there. And the idea was that SoftQuad would fund development of what would become an open source DSL implementation.
Okay.
Unfortunately, and we had a scheme interpreter, and DSL used a Lisp or scheme dialect, and we already had a scheme interpreter that was integrated with an SGML parser. So we were going to contribute that. On the morning that I was going to chair the symposium, everyone got there except the developers from SoftQuad. And eventually I said, what's happening? And they said, we're not able to join you. And the head of development at SoftQuad had at that just an hour before the meeting began, had said SoftQuad is not going to participate in this. So we had the symposium anyway, and some good did actually come out of it. James in particular got to play with Explorer, which later became Panorama. And Yuri at the SGML conference ran a meeting. He used the conference chairs, let him, the hotel let him have a meeting associated with the conference. But in order to keep the press out, because the press were very excited with all the things that were happening, the early web, he called it the Dog Sledding, Skiing and Surfing League meeting. And I think we had maybe a dozen or more people at that meeting. And we went through a list of things that should be in a style sheet language for the web. And really, that was the inaugural XSL meeting.
That's great. That's great.
Yep.
Did not know that history.
I got laid off. SoftQuad imploded. Yuri died. And it became really obvious. I mean, I'd seen this very clearly beforehand, but Yuri had collected people, and the people were not necessarily on speaking terms with one another. So it was not uncommon to have a meeting where someone from one of the other groups that was needed would walk out of the meeting mid-meeting just because they weren't willing to be in the same room with someone else. And so, you're having a development strategy meeting and you've got sales, marketing and development, and then development walks out or sales walks out or marketing walks out. And it doesn't matter which, you've got a dysfunctional company. So 2 years later, it crashed. We had a big project going with Panorama, in fact, that they cancelled because the new management didn't understand it.
Okay.
So, so there were problems all around. HoTMetaL sales had gone down. Author editor sales had gone down because people were moving to the web.
Right.
And I got about a year later, I moved to a company that was doing something else, not XML. A company called Groveware in Toronto. We were trying to make a calendar system. And And then it turned out the venture capitalist behind it had lied about how much money he had and what was happening, and we suddenly all got laid off. And around then, Tim Berners-Lee emailed me and said, would you like to come and work for me? But I had just married, and the day after I got back from my honeymoon, my husband was diagnosed with cancer.
Oh dear. Okay.
And I said, right now, I'm really busy. I can't do it right now. I did a bunch of stuff like commercial XSLT consulting, which was a lot of fun, including for one of the best companies I ever worked with, which was Wiley Interscience in the UK. I remember having, I think you took on that project, didn't you, afterwards? I don't remember, but it was, they were putting, it was major reference works they were putting on the web. Their first project was getting some Dussel going, which someone had got it almost going, and they weren't quite able to, they weren't detail oriented enough. So someone would say, they would say, they said the footnote markers are too large inside captions. And so in the next release, what the person had done is made the entire caption smaller, the font size smaller in the entire caption, not just the footnote marker, because they didn't quite have the attention to detail. And typography does take a huge attention to detail.
Sure.
So I did that project for them. I got their Dussel going with James's tool, in fact.
You wrote some with Jade, was it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Jade. Didn't you write some books as well with Wiley?
I did. I did write some books with Wiley, although different division. One of the things while I was at Groveware, Ian Graham and I wrote a book, the annotated XML specification. Unfortunately, the month that it was published, Tim Bray published one that was free on the web. And there was another one published by Prentice Hall in Charles Goldfarb's series. And Prentice Hall spent a lot of money marketing. Tim Bray was better known than me, obviously. And us really didn't do very well.
Right.
I think it probably wasn't a bad book. It was just unfortunate there was too much competition. And within a year, it wasn't very interesting. We could have updated it and made it interesting, but it would have needed to be more successful.
Right.
So I actually have written several books and chapters in others. The most recent, I think, was in 2016, maybe. I don't remember. Was sitting on my shelf behind me. Oh, you can't quite see it. Beginning XML.
Okay. So you mentioned you segued there into the whole XSL thing. Can you remember the history of how? Obviously, this is quite a mouthful. Document style specification language or something. I can't even remember myself.
Yes.
There's lots of S's in it. Who came up with the idea of calling it XSL?
I actually wasn't in those meetings. I remember being at a conference, and the first meeting I was excluded from, and I handed a handwritten set of notes to Paul Grosso of Arbortext as he went in. And I think very early on, Sharon Adler became chair of that work, who was a very successful and able chair for many years. I mean, she produced XSLT, she produced XSLFO,
right?
The formatting spec. But I don't know at what point they chose the XSL name. It was quite a good. It was quite a good choice.
Yeah.
I think there has been an ongoing problem, which is that even though we made XML as it was really WebSGML, the idea there was no intent for XML to exist outside a plugin originally, and the idea was absolutely not that XML would replace HTML. XHTML came as a big surprise to most of us, and if we had planned from the start for XHTML, as Jenny Tonneson said in a keynote to an XML Prague once, we would have done it differently.
Indeed.
The error handling would have been different, and I mean a whole bunch of things would have been different. And hypertext links would have had to have been built in and not a separate spec.
Right.
But we were not designing it to replace HTML. And similarly, there was no push for apart from at one exploratory meeting that I wasn't at in Paris, there was for the CSS and XSL to get together.
Right.
There was no effort, no intent for XSL to replace CSS. They're doing different things. XSL is formatting this thing that's not replacing HTML, and CSS is formatting HTML. So there should have been no contest, but in fact, there was a lot of antipathy between the groups.
Indeed, yeah. Always struck
So
me as
after
interesting that CSS goes straight from here's the content, here's how you style it, whereas XSL I guess from its DISL heritage had this kind of two-phase thing about like step number one, you transform it so that it's even possible to style it reasonably, and then you apply the styling.
yeah,
I think from that architectural split, some interesting things have followed. I guess most notably things like Schematron come to mind, right? Where, here's a style sheet whose goal in life was not to produce, a rendered output at all, but to, if you validate the structure of the input document, then the output is more of a report than it is an attempt to style the content.
one of the great things that XML enables, and HTML too, in fact, but I call it the XML promise, is that any XML processor can read any XML document. And all right, it might have an application sitting on top of it that expects an HTML element, or it expects a telephone exchange manual element, or a stock exchange money transfer element, whatever, or a TEI element. It doesn't matter. But any processor can process any XML document. That's our promise. And we worked really hard when I was at W3C. We worked really hard to try and keep that true. So there are no extensions, or there's nothing that would prevent one program from reading something made by another. This means, for example, as you say, we can have Schematron processing an XML file in a completely different way than the SVG formatter.
Right.
And you can have another process that reads an SVG document and, for example, takes all the text out of it to be translated. That's in fact how Red Hat used to do a lot of their marketing brochures, is they would design them in the program in Inkscape, or Soddy Poddy as it was before it was Inkscape. Great name. And then they would use this XSLT to extract all of the text, send it off to translators, and use XSLT to put it back into different SVG diagrams for different people.
Right.
So you could think of an XSL processor as a function,
right,
that takes an XML document as an input and produces whatever it wants to as an output. That's our XML. That's our XML promise. That's a really kind of major architectural thing that I pushed for a long time. And in fact, I was doing all this work. Well, let's see. Microphone fell apart. While doing all this, its anti-pop stand fell apart. I hope it didn't make loud noises at your end. Sorry. So I was doing this consulting in XSLT and being visible in conferences and writing on mailing lists. I learned, in fact, when I left SoftQuad, when they laid me off, they shortly afterwards had calls from concerned customers saying, "Are you getting out of the markup business? Because we can't imagine you laying off Liam Quin if you were still going to be in markup." And they were a bit surprised, but this is, of course, because I was the face of SoftQuad at conferences and on mailing lists. I was, for many technical people, I was the public face. And the people inside the company didn't know this because they didn't go to the conferences.
Right. Brilliant.
So I was still being very active in the XML mailing list and all this stuff. And I got a mail from Tim Berners-Lee saying, "Are you ready in 2000? Are you ready to come back? You want to work for W3C?" And I said, "Okay, I'd like to." And they sent me down in spring of 2001 for an interview. It took me a few months to get a visa a work permit for the US and got a work permit. So I went down and worked there for 6 months, which they required at the time. And then I came back to Toronto, and I was actually quite relieved to get home, to be honest.
Right.
It's a very, very different culture. And that goes back to the thing I said I would come back to probably earlier, which is the reason that we could sell TROF in Europe, and the same reason that XML has become unpopular, and it would be very difficult to sell XML software today in North America, but there are XML companies in Europe still going quite strongly and getting new customers, is because there's this cultural idea in business in the US and Canada. I don't know about Mexico, but in the US and Canada, that they call best of breed. So the idea is, and the chief technology officers, who reports to the president of the company, the CTO, he will ask his staff to find, we've got to have a relational database, which one is the market leader, which one is the best. We all need new socks, which ones are the most fashionable right now. So when the web came out and was fashionable, they said, all right, we need an information system. What is the market leader? What's the best of breed? It's not HTML, it's not XML, it's the web. Okay, that's the cultural thing. In Europe, what they do generally, not everyone, and it's not everyone in the US or Canada that works that way, but in Europe, they'll typically say, what are our needs? Which product best fulfills our needs? Is it sane? All right. Are we risking a 100 million euro company or $1 billion euro company on something written by someone's back garage? And if so, can we buy? And if so, can we buy the company?
Right.
If not, if it's a reasonable sized company, or if there's multiple vendors, we'll go for it because it meets our needs. And then very often the US companies end up with a product that doesn't meet their needs, that is the best of breed in the vague area.
Right. It's funny. I mean, a couple of times now you've mentioned the X11 system, and I remember one of the first machines when I was working in financial services many moons ago. It was on Sun Solaris, Motorola 6800, chipsets, those kind of machines that I was working on. At one stage, they did introduce, Sun did introduce a machine called the Roadrunner, which didn't last very long, but that had an Intel 80386 in it. But I remember it was actually my first exposure to O'Reilly, which was buying the X11, the 3-volume set of the API documentation for X11, which I later found out was actually, obviously they were instrumental in the creation of DocBook and, all of that whole thing.
Yes.
I do remember looking at, the X11 things and thinking how odd it was that the words client and server were turned the wrong way around in my head in the way X11 was worded. But there's this weird way in which in the modern web, because you've got the canvas element, right? You can basically scribble things on the screen these days. That is essentially it's kind of X11, inside all of these layers of web browser technology. So if you happen to be using, say, a Linux machine that's using X11 under the hood for its desktop, like say Ubuntu, then you run a browser on your Ubuntu machine. There's this weird way in which you're actually running an X11 inside an X11.
Yes.
With all of this huge amount of network traffic in order to paint the stuff on the screen.
And the fun thing about that is those O'Reilly manuals were formatted with software TROF.
Were they? I did not know that. Okay.
And Softcode was an auto ship customer. We got a copy of every O'Reilly book that was produced because they used our software. And I think of all the technologies that were around at that time, Sun had a technology called News, or Newes as they pronounced it, which was a graphical display system written in PostScript. not to be confused with the thing that ran on the Next, which was Adobe's display PostScript. It was completely different. It was a different implementation of PostScript, and it had you ran PostScript in the server, and you could create windows. You could have a whole application written in PostScript. Whereas with display PostScript, you could just basically draw into canvas, kind of like JavaScript and HTML. With News, the entire windowing system was written in this extensible object-oriented programming language. So you could do things like send the window manager a new method to draw window borders, and suddenly all your window borders look different.
Right.
The machines were not powerful enough at the time to run it, quite frankly, except the very newest Sun machines. And by the time they were, politics had happened, and Adobe had said, we will not port Photoshop to Solaris. I guess I can say this in public now. We will not port Photoshop in public. We will not port Photoshop to Solaris and Spark unless you drop News and go with display PostScript, our vastly inferior system that will cost you more money. And so Sun did.
I see.
Because they wanted Photoshop. And I got to see it demonstrated while we were busy demonstrating HoTMetaL and Panorama. At the next booth was Sun, and they would demonstrate how fast Photoshop ran on their Spark systems. And they had almost the most fun I've ever seen of anyone giving a tech demo, because someone would come up, they'd wait till a few people came up and said, thank you for watching, I'll just start Photoshop. And the people would say, well, I don't think we'll have time to while Photoshop starts. You'd say, no, it's already running. Now, I'm opening an image. Well, we don't know if we have time for all that grey bar land. No, it's open. I'm going to run Gaussian blur. What radius would you like? We'll do, 50 pixels. There, it's done. Now, if we could, my associates will just pick your jewels up off the floor here.
Wow.
And then every time they would ask the killer question, is it Mac compatible?
Okay.
And the answer was always no.
Sure.
Wouldn't work on a Mac network. You couldn't take Mac files across. And so they'd say, all right, well, it's really nice that it can be this fast. We're amazed. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
And for that, they actually lost a lot of goodwill, a lot of market share. But anyway, that was going on at the same time as Steve Downey, this head of sales I mentioned before, was on the next trade show booth in Las Vegas. We'd spent, I think, $60,000 on the trade show booth. And we were wearing our softquad jackets and our softquad shirts. And the customers were so desperate to buy the product, HoTMetaL, that they were on their hands and knees on the floor assembling boxes.
Wow.
Because we were selling them faster than we can put them together.
Wow.
And the sales staff had a pre-canned demo. And in the end, I started saying to them, look, you've sold it after 10 seconds. There's no need to do the full 3 minutes. These people, look, it's over here. Join the queue, and we can show more people. We sold $30,000 worth of HoTMetaL on the show floor.
Isn't it amazing those things happen?
Yeah. There's all this excitement about the web. It's huge excitement.
Yeah, sure. I remember it. I think I was in New York and I was reading, I think it was the New York Times, and I saw, www. something. I saw a web address, in the New York Times, and I was like, oh yeah, it's building now, really building now. It's been quite a wild ride. It would be remiss of me now, while we have you, Liam. I've asked everyone else, towards the end of these talks, I've asked about the dreaded AI question, and what your perspective is on all of that stuff. The reason it comes to mind now is just I have exactly the same feelings about this as I had about the buzz that happened around the web. I don't know if this is going to have a same or different result, but it definitely has. It's the biggest buzz I've seen since that early excitement about the web. What are your thoughts?
In the 1980s, when I was on Usenet, just as you were with the dial-up modem,
Yeah.
there was a posting in I think it was in alt.singles or possibly alt.suicide. I can't remember. I think it was alt.singles that turned out to be by Rob Pike, but it was actually signed Mark R. Cheney. And it was such a wild, weird piece of language that my best friend Kay Decker at the time and I looked at this, and we started looking for posts by this guy to work out whether this person was human or not. And eventually it became clear, and the paper was published and it was revealed. It was, he took the day's postings to the newsgroup channel and ran them through a Markov chain text generator. And a Markov chain text generator just takes, basically builds a data structure whereby it can say, given, for example, these 3 words that we've seen so far, what is the most likely next word? And keep going and generate random text. And it generates startlingly random text, but it will tend to veer off. It won't be coherent as a whole.
Right.
And there was an interesting question. What would happen if you built a model out of millions or billions of documents? Someone once gave me, while we were developing SGML, I took the SGML mailing list and ran it through a Markov chain generator and privately sent it to John Bozak just because I thought he needed cheering up and something funny. It was hilarious, but I didn't post it publicly because, of course, it used people's posts without their permission. But what would happen if you took millions of documents? Someone gave me an SGML corpus, but it was really tiny compared to what I needed. So someone did it on web scale, of course, as we know, and we got large scale language models. And the things are clockwork. They're saying, given the past 3 words, what's the most likely next word in the context of this prompt? And that's the big difference, is it's still in the context of, is that it has a context which tries to keep it on track. And it has this kind of mathematical approach to try to make it not going down into digressions and get lost.
Right.
Unlike us humans.
Yeah.
But, and it's very interesting and lots of fun. I at one point generated something. My partner was doing a degree in, my husband was doing a degree in art in upstate New York in Oswego University, really good faculty. And we were looking at reading art magazines, going to art galleries, reading the descriptions that the art curators placed there. And so I wrote a program that generated random art criticism, because this, the deep, meaningful diagonals and strong emotional swirls of this piece signify the Holy Trinity.
Right.
And you asked the artist, and he said, well, I'd run out of that orange paint I was using, and all I had was the blue and the green. So I thought I'd just use, so random text with no concept. There is no understanding. There is no intelligence.
Right.
And people argue this a lot, but mathematically, there is no modeling of intelligence going on here.
Right.
The hope is that it's an emergent pattern, but you can easily. Now, AI in the 1980s, researchers started asking humans questions. So they said, we've got a hypothesis that the human brain is using first order propositional calculus, which is basic logic.
Right.
So if we're using logic, then most people will get these syllogisms right because it's how the brain works. And they asked people, and most people got them wrong. There's a whole category of syllogisms that most people get wrong, that a system based on propositional calculus would get right. They're all about many and most. Many people do this, most people who do that, therefore all people do something else. Well, No, it doesn't work that way,
Mhm.
and we go wrong. And this proved that humans at a conscious level are not using logic. We don't work that way, at least not propositional calculus. AIs do the same thing. You can ask them reasoning questions.
Yeah.
So what do I think of AI? Number one, the technology is great and a lot of fun.
Oh.
Okay. Number two, the technology has been trained on include excerpts, including books that I wrote,
Right.
and I wasn't asked, including web pages I have on the web, and I wasn't asked. They're copyright. You can't do that. It's against the law. And that's what copyright is for. It says who can copy this text. And no, you can't. In fact, something is public. It's like someone saying, I found this image on Google, so I don't have to pay for it. No, Google's a search engine. It's not hosting images. You found it at someone's website and you stole it. Find out if they license it for free or not. It's very easy. I found this apple on a barrow in the marketplace and it was in a public place. So no, I can't. And so that's one problem. It's a really huge problem with art, but it's a problem with writing too, with visual art, but it's a problem with writing too. When you're implementing AI, even if it's legally trained, when you're implementing AI in a company, I met someone who I won't name, not least because he didn't tell me his name, but I met someone while I was waiting for a train who was an investment banker. And he was a database programmer at an investment bank as well. And he had written a standards conformance liability database. Most people would not guess that an investment bank would have one of these. They say, the law says we must do this, but it costs us more money to do this. What is the consequence of not doing this?
Right.
If the consequence of not doing this is we get a fine, and the fine is 1/10 of the amount that we make,
right?
When you put AI into a company, you might not be, selling arms illegally into a company that might have billions of dollars consequences, but you might be doing technical support. You might have people are typing a question. I'm involved in the GNU image editing program, GIMP, and people might say all my windows have disappeared. And if we had an AI technical support program, it would say, have you tried pressing tab? And they'd say, oh, I pressed tab and all my windows come back. Thank you. All right. Now, if that wasn't their problem, the liability would be zero. Right. We wouldn't. If it mostly went wrong and we put it up as an official service, then the liability would be we'd lose people because they'd say GIMP support's so bad. All right. If a doctor is doing an operation and an automatic assistant says, at this time, you must put forceps around this blood vessel, and the patient dies as a result, there's unlimited liability. If you're repairing an aircraft and the documentation says, at this point, loosen the bolts on the landing gear. The bolts should be left loose for cold weather safety. And the aircraft then crashes as a result of what you did. There's unlimited liability. There is no upward limit on the liability in an airline crash. It's very scary for airlines. It has to go to court. The airline will say, to each person, I'll give you $10,000 if you won't take this to court. And anyone with 2 or more brain cells will say no, or refuse that offer, because they know if they go to court, they'll get more than that. So when you put AI in, you have to think about, is it helping people more than it's hindering? Is it saving you more money than it's costing you? Is it opening all these people doing vibe coding, as they call it, with no background in security, get really excited by writing things, and then what is the legal liability if there's a break-in?
Yeah.
What is the technical liability? What is the technical debt when someone has to replace your code a year from now?
Sure.
Right. So there are great uses for AI. I saw a great one correcting OCR'd books.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But you can train that on publicly available data. Like, because there's so much stuff that has been OCR'd, things like the proofreading project, distributed proofreading project, and Project Gutenberg, which of course work together, and a great many other. I came across, there's a early English books online project with 60,000 books, for example. Although in that case there was no OCR, but you can get at public domain texts. You can get at texts where you have both the input and the output, and that's what you need to train a model.
Right.
So stuff that's trained legally, great. Stuff that's trained legally and is used in a circumstance where its propensity to tell lies,
Right.
doesn't matter, great.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Stuff that's you asked me about the bubble, and you're absolutely right. Tim Bray used to talk about internet fairy dust.
Right.
When there was this bubble, and if you made an internet-enabled boat anchor, people would pay more for it.
Right. Right. Right.
Well,
we now have AI toothbrushes. I saw one recently, so that's probably an indication that it's a little bit frothy. All right. Well, it's been fabulous talking to you, Liam. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much. It's great to catch up with you again.